Any abusive or inappropriate behaviour will not be tolerated and participants may be removed. And if our safe space is significantly compromised, we may feel the need to shut down the meeting at short notice. But I'm sure that won't happen this evening. I am dying to hear from Nan, and we will get started very soon. But just as a brief introduction, my name's Kieran. I am LWN's National Secretary, so I have the privilege of knowing and working very closely with Nan and seeing her in action. She's always been a very formidable political operative, and she can spin a good yarn too. She can tell some good stories and has written some excellent books. And that's what we're here to hear more about this evening. I will let Nan introduce herself. I'm sure many of us at tonight's meeting know about Nan, but Nan, if you could introduce yourself before reading us a sneak peek, a bit of a passage from the book, then we'll get into our discussion this evening. Over to you, Nan.
Lovely, thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you all very much for joining this evening and for being interested in my new book, which I have to say, since I wrote it during lockdown, seems newer to other people than it does to me. I am Nan Sloane. I am an author. I also run or lead on Labour Women's Network's training programme, which is how I've come to know many of you. It's a great privilege, really, to be able to think and research the history of women who engaged in political activity so long before us in such a different world and with such varying objectives and varying results. And I think one of the things that writing the book has taught me is that the history of political women is much longer than we think it is, and much more interesting and varied than we think it is. And I hope if you read the book that you will also find this from it. The women in it are very different. There are women from all kinds of backgrounds. There are middle-class women, there are working-class women, there are women who led quite privileged lives, but still came to radical political conclusions. There are women who led very deprived lives, but still had agency. And I think that is one of the things that comes out of the book, is that women who we think had no agency, or who spent their time running around in bonnets and empire line dresses, actually had all kinds of agency despite their legal disabilities. So I'm going to read you a short extract about the morning of Peterloo. And I chose Peterloo because most of us have heard of it. Some of us have seen the film. My account is not much like the film because I'm looking specifically at the role of the women in the day rather than the detailed account of the day itself. And it's also a really good example of where women are often thought of solely as victims, but actually had agency in their own right in a national event. I'm not going to read an account of what happened in the afternoon. This is about the morning when people were arriving. But there are a couple of things I just need to explain before I do, so that it is intelligible, because one or two bits of language are very different from now. The first thing is that what we think of as Peterloo was thought of at the time and referred to at the time as the Manchester meeting. And it was the Manchester meeting because it was a culmination of a long series of very big public meetings that have been happening throughout the spring and early summer across the north of England, in Birmingham, and one in London. And they were designed to bring the campaign for parliamentary reform and for adult male suffrage, there was no female suffrage campaign at this time, to public attention and to bring pressure to bear on the government to consider and to carry out parliamentary reform. So it wasn't seen at the time as a one-off, it was seen as a culmination. There was a lot of excitement around it. Some of the earlier meetings had been violent, or there had been violence at some of the earlier meetings. So it was, people thought that there might be violence at this one. So the idea that everybody turned up with no idea of what was going to happen is not actually true. Secondly, during the period while people were, while these meetings were going on, women had got together, working class women had got together and set up female reform societies to support the national reform movement. And these are, so far as we know, the first working class self-organised women's political groups. They didn't last very long, but they were there, and they had a huge impact. They were novel, they were shocking to some people, outrageous to other people. And there is a whole chapter about them in the book, which again, they're fascinating, and the accounts of their meetings are very interesting, and the political documents that they produced are very interesting. And then three quick things. Henry Hunt was the superstar of the reform movement. The movement's motto was Hunt and Liberty, and he was the star attraction at any event that he went to. The cap of liberty was a knitted, usually red cap used as a symbol of revolution. So it was very alarming to the establishment and very popular amongst the working classes. And the word hustings, which we think of in purely an electoral setting, then meant any platform with speakers. So there are references to hustings in it that have got absolutely nothing to do with elections, and that in this case refer to a couple of carts pushed together in the middle of a field from which the speech is going to be made. So bearing all of that in mind, I will read you an extract. Monday the 16th of August 1819 dawned as a warm, sunny summer's day with a light breeze relieving the heat for those marching in from any distance. At an early hour, groups of reformers began to gather with their banners at the meeting places to form themselves into ranks. Speakers reminded them of the importance of the event and the need to remain peaceful. One after another, as the early morning light grew stronger, processions of people began to leave the towns surrounding Manchester, marching in good order and carrying banners and caps of liberty. Some had serviceable walking sticks, but there was no sign of the pikes the authorities had been worried about, nor did there seem to be any firearms. As the central columns marched, they acquired followers and hangers-on, but by and large, order was maintained, and gradually the streams of people began to merge as they reached the main roads leading into Manchester. Innkeepers, pub landlords and farmers' wives did a good trade in refreshments as the day began to grow warmer. Later, there were claims that some people were drunk by the time they got to St. Peter's Field. Almost every cotton town within what would then have been considered reasonable walking distance of Manchester sent its own contingent. From Stockport came about 1,500 people, described as walking well in step, with time being kept by about 30 stout lads in the body of the column. 40 women marched in the middle, with a member of the committee of the Female Reform Society, Mary Waterworth, carrying a banner which read, "Success to the female reformers of Stockport." Organised groups of women also came from Oldham, Royton, Bury, Rochdale, Ashton, Stalybridge, and more from many other towns and villages. The men marched alongside the women, often surrounding them as a protective guard, but women also sometimes led the columns. Almost all the female reformers wore the white dresses and green sashes that had become their trademark. Other women walked with their families or just joined because they thought it might be a good day out. Once the processions reached Manchester, they were joined by women from that town, whilst the Manchester Female Reform Society itself and the Manchester Patriotic Union gathered at the place where Henry Hunt and his party were waiting to set off. Considerable thought had gone into how Hunt, the star attraction of the day, should arrive at St. Peter's Field. As on other occasions, he would travel in an open carriage with prominent local reformers, and a contingent of local supporters would provide an escort. A novel feature of this plan was the presence of organised companies of women, and it was intended that the Middleton female reformers should march ahead of the vehicle and the Manchester women behind, with the men surrounding them. Hunt, who had an eye for the dramatic, had, by his own account, the idea for one of the most striking images of the day. According to him, we very soon met the Manchester Committee of Female Reformers, headed by Mrs. Fildes, who bore in her hand a small white silk flag. These females were all handsomely dressed in white, and they proposed to lead the procession to the field, walking 2 and 2. But as, in consequence of the crowd, this was found to be impossible, they fell into the rear of the barouche, in which position they maintained with some difficulty during the whole way till we arrived at the hustings. Mrs. Fildes, who carried the flag, was taken up at my suggestion and rode by the side of the coachman, bearing her colours in a most gallant style. Another man thought Mary was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. The bookseller and polemicist Richard Carlile, who had come up from London for the meeting, described her as an interesting-looking woman, bearing a standard on which was painted a female, holding in her hand a flag surmounted with a cap of liberty, whilst she trod underfoot an emblem of corruption on which was inscribed that word. She was requested to take a seat on the box of the carriage, a most appropriate one, which she boldly and immediately acquiesced in, and continued waving her flag and handkerchief until she reached the hustings, where she took her stand at the front on the right. The Manchester Chronicle was rather less enthusiastic, however, describing how, at 1:15 o'clock, a body of women, it's in italics, so you know it should be pronounced like that, in treble files, marched in with music, and soon after a great number of men, 4 or 5 deep, marched in, with drum beating, music playing, a red pole, and the cap of liberty hoisted. At 1:15, a very large procession advanced from Deansgate, headed by an open carriage with a woman in front, who bore and brandished a flag with an inscription. In the car were 5 persons, one of whom gave a signal for a general shout on approaching the hustings. Not all women approved of what was happening either. The Times reporter noted, "A group of the women of Manchester, attracted by the crowd, came to the corner of the street where we had taken our post. They viewed these female reformers for some time with a look in which compassion and disgust were equally blended, and at last burst out into an indignant exclamation, 'Go home to your families and leave such like matters as these to your husbands and sons who better understand them.' The women who thus addressed them were of the lower order in life." When the various processions arrived at the field, they were marshalled by stewards, who told the columns of female reformers to gather round the platform. Jemima Bamford related that the woman with whom she was walking, a Mrs. Yates, held on to her arm and would keep hurrying forward to get a good place. And when the crowd opened for the Middleton procession, Mrs. Yates and myself and some others of the women went close to the hustings, quite glad that we had obtained such a situation for seeing and hearing all. Some women were to be on the hustings itself to present banners and caps of liberty and hand over and possibly read addresses. As the field filled up, other women were scattered amongst the crowd, some in groups, sometimes with their menfolk, even a few on their own. Richard Carlyle described the wind ruffling their long hair amidst a general air of sunny anticipation. There has subsequently been much discussion of how many women were on the field of Peterloo and in what capacity they got there. After the event, the authorities tried to say that there had been very few, but hardly anybody else agreed with them. The radical leaders, on the other hand, were keen to assert that the intention had been peaceful and suggested that women were there with their families almost as though for a holiday outing. However, this does not exactly square with contemporary accounts. Careful analysis of the various claims has resulted in the current view that women, amongst whose number children were included, constituted about an 8th or 12% of the assembled crowd. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 60 and 80,000 people gathered on St. Peter's Field that day, of whom only something between 7,500 and 9,000 were women, and many of those had arrived as part of organised groups. Women were certainly present in unusually high numbers, and their visibility and level of organisation were also for many a provocative novelty, but the crowd remained overwhelmingly male in both number and tone. Hunt's carriage took a long time to make its way through the streets to St. Peter's Field. At every stage, it was held up by the crowds, but it kept moving slowly along until it arrived at the edge of the space where the huge throng awaited it. At this point, the brass bands which had been entertaining the crowd struck up "See the Conquering Hero Comes" from Handel's Judas Maccabeus, a tune well known by everybody. Hunt stood up in the carriage and waved his trademark white hat as the cheering crowd made way for him. The carriage was parked next to the hustings, and Hunt and his companions got out and mounted the platform. The Manchester women joined the other female reformers at the front. One woman, Elizabeth Gaunt, was pregnant and exhausted, and Hunt suggested that she rest in the carriage. Mary Files and several other women climbed onto the hustings with their banners and caps of liberty, where Richard Carlyle saw that Mary was elevated at one corner at the front, with a banner in her hand and resting on a large drum, a most singular and interesting situation for a female at such a meeting, but a completer heroine never figured in any situation before. Joan of Arc could not have been more interesting. The platform party which faced the vast crowd was large and consisted of several different groups. First, there were the reformers, who constituted the main element, and most of whom intended to speak. Then there were the female reformers, probably about 8 or 10 of them, ready to play their part in the proceedings, providing a very noticeable, very dramatic and rather unsettling demonstration of solidarity. One carried a white board with order painted on it, and several carried addresses to be presented to Hunt. But there was also a small contingent of journalists, not just from Manchester, but also from London, who had come to observe what everyone knew was, for one reason or another, going to be a significant event. The Manchester meeting was the first of its kind to attract national attention and to make London-based newspapers think it worth actually sending someone to a place which took over 30 hours to reach by coach, rather than depending on second-hand accounts many days or even weeks later. What happened next, as these people all crammed onto the limited space on the hustings, would reverberate around the country in a new and immediate way. Thank you.
Oh, she's going to stop there.
She is.
The reverberations. You set the scene so well. I can see it, I can hear it, I can almost smell it, the anticipation of what's going to come next. If you want to know, buy the book. And so my first question isn't what happens next. It is, well, why are these women there, Nan?
They were there because they wanted to be. And given that there are so many narratives of women as victims in our political history, women without agency, women who are sort of blown about in the historic who don't seem to have often purpose. It's really important that we remember that despite their difficulties, women did have agency. They could make decisions themselves. I mean, this was a period when women had no legal or social or economic or political rights at all. But women did have and did negotiate how they would operate within those restrictions in ways that seem odd to us because we have so many freedoms as a result of our foremothers having fought for them, but which seem natural to them. And so, for instance, Jemima Bamford, who was generally regarded as a very good wife, nevertheless said that she intended to go to the meeting whether her husband allowed her to or not. And there were many other women in that situation. Because they were working class women, they had more freedom than middle class women. So they were much less chaperoned, much less watched over. They were accustomed to going out to work when they could get work. And so they had more independence. And they were there because they wanted to support the reform movement. They genuinely believed that parliamentary reform and votes for the men in their families would overnight change the situation in which they found themselves.
And let's stay with that idea of parliamentary reform then, and the reform movement, which is often in anything that I've read and seen is very much narrated in a male voice, the men at the time, the movements at the time, the petitioning at the time. And we all know that motivation to turn up for a meeting, for a protest, for a hustings, often are because people, and in this case these women, have been inspired by ideas. And the earlier section in your book, because this reading that we've done from Peterloo isn't the first part of the book, but your earlier section is full about how the ideas of the time actually very much were shaped by some very prominent female voices. Do you just want to touch upon some of those ideas or some of those characters who were promoting the ideas of liberty at the time?
Well, there were one of the things that we think of when we think of this period is a limited number of female writers, predominantly some kind of variation on Jane Austen, or I have no objection to Jane Austen, it's just that she isn't all that there was, or Mary Wollstonecraft and the mother of feminism. And both of these ideas are flawed, really. There were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women writing everything in every possible genre at the time. And they wrote under over their own names. So this idea of Jane Austen didn't publish over her own name because women didn't do that. It's just complete nonsense. Women did publish over their own names. Women might choose, if they wanted to remain anonymous, to do that, and that was fine. That was not unusual, but it was a choice. Men also published anonymously. So Walter Scott, who is one of the most famous authors of the age, sort of Dickens before Dickens, published a great many of his novels anonymously, and then 2 or 3 editions in, there would be the big reveal. So the who has written this book would run in the media, and then there'd be, ta-da, it's Walter Scott. And then he'd sell more copies. So there were, the things that we attribute to women are not necessarily solely attributable to women, and the sort of shrinking violet approach to writing that we attribute to them is not true either. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the Mary Wollstonecraft issue. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote about a huge number of things besides feminism. So she was interested in land reform. She was interested in revolutionary ideas. So ideas around liberty, around constitutions, around who should and shouldn't vote. I mean, she did say, I shall excite laughter if I suggest that women should be able to vote. And she did also think later on, towards the end of her life, that women should not be allowed to vote because they were too uneducated and silly. However, which I think doesn't sit very well with the mother of feminism, however, she was about much more than women's rights. She was about the full range of things, and her early political tracts were written in response to events around the French Revolution, not so that the Vindication of the Rights of Woman was written in response to the revolutionary French government excluding women from citizenship and from education. And then between those two, you have every kind of political writing that you can imagine. And you have right-wing women like Hannah More writing in support of Church and King. And then you have women like Anna Letitia Barbauld, who is in the book, who was a middle-class, middle-aged, respectable woman who had a long career as a poet and an educator and a writer of very popular children's books, which were still read well into the Victorian age, but who also wrote explosive political work. She attacked the government, she attacked the war, both the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which lasted for nearly 20 years. She was a dissident in religious terms, so was non-conformist, so not a member of the Church of England, therefore discriminated against in social and political terms. She attacked that. She wrote about discrimination in a way that is recognizably almost modern. The language slightly differs, but the approach and the attack and the ideas behind it are almost modern. And she was very much attacked for, one of the reviewers said, when ladies condescend to write politics, they must condescend also to have their ideas examined. And her view was, well, examine away, because I know what I think and I'm going to say so. So there are women like her. And then at the other end of the book, there are women like Anna Doyle Wheeler, who is a feminist you have almost certainly never heard of, who, together with her friend William Thompson, wrote a book called An Appeal from One Half of the Human Race Women to the Other Half Men, which basically attacked the whole structure of society and in particular marriage, which people found so shocking that the book was something that no nice person would allow in their house, let alone in the hands of their wives and daughters. So there were lots of women writing about lots of things. It was very hard to choose who to include and who not to put in, because there is actually a huge amount of material there that people could do some very interesting work on, should they wish.
And I think that idea then of being spoilt for choice in terms of who to bring back these wonderful women in their writing is not something that we would necessarily immediately jump to when people think we're revealing these hidden histories. Like, it must have been really challenging to find these women and in their words. But actually what you're saying there is there were loads of women talking about loads of things all of the time, because actually the context in which we're talking about was incredibly revolutionary. We had the French Revolution inspired by the American Revolution, and all of that will have played out as to what was going on in Britain at the time. So I think when I read the earlier chapters of the book, so the women who were engaging in this debate, political thought, political ideas, novelists, poets who were thinking, big P politics, there was quite a lot of anger and rage and fury, and it to the point at which Mary Wollstonecraft writes her response in kind of one long session, doesn't she? She's trying to get it all out because she's so infuriated as to what she sees going on in France at the time, and I suppose the letdown or the failures of that French revolutionary government. So I was just wondering, how far do you think, specifically on the women in that earlier period, how far would these women's work have been perhaps better remembered if the French Revolution played out differently?
I think it would be nice to think that they would be better remembered if it had played out differently, but I actually don't think that that is the case because of the general feeling against women being involved in politics and against women being having opinions or expressing opinions on politics. The idea of women novelists was not a problem. Everybody, people accepted that. People read their novels. Their novels were very profitable. Publishers queued up to sign them up. There was, and women were also accepted as poets, and in some cases were very well-known poets, very high-profile poets. The problem for all of them, for particularly the poets, was that there was no pinnacle of their profession, as it were. So, Wordsworth could go and become poet laureate, but there was never going to be, at that point in history, a female poet laureate. But nevertheless, they were very well known. They were often much admired by the men. Wordsworth much admired Anna Letitia Barbauld's poetry. And he also was very keen on the poetry of another woman in the book called Helen Maria Williams, who was became a revolutionary woman. And he actually wrote a poem about his emotions on reading one of her poems. So they were not, it has also to be said that 20 years later, he was referring to Anna Letitia Barbauld and because of her politics as that old snake. So, people moved to the right then as now. I think, though, that for two reasons. One is the general assumption that women would not be political. Anna Letitia Barbauld became unpopular when she wrote about politics. And when the Victorians, when we got into the Victorian age, the Victorians loved her children's books because they'd had them as children and wanted their children to have them. And so they retained her as a children's writer, but they simply blanked all her political writings. And when her niece was putting together an anthology of all her work and wanted to put the political stuff in with everything else, she agonized for some time about whether or not to do it, because it would cause them all a lot of trouble. So I think the Victorians, as we know, were not very friendly to women as a society. And I think that even those who might otherwise have been remembered for political reasons were just quietly put to one side once we get into the Victorian age. And so I think actually whatever the outcome of the revolution, these women would just have been parked in a corner and left there as they were. They're not hard to find, but it's hard to find people who have heard of them now.
But I suppose their ideas live on. And so we've talked quite a lot now about the ideas and the women as intellectuals at the time, talking about politics, reforming the current state of play, moving to complete revolution. It's clear from the book and what you said at the beginning that women from all backgrounds were actively involved in the development of democracy as we know it today. I'm interested now in some reflections or some examples of how working class women tried to bring about change as well.
Well, working class women are interesting, partly because people just assume they weren't there. And as always, they were. Working class women were living through one of the greatest and most disruptive periods of change in our entire history, because this is the early period of the Industrial Revolution. And there was massive upheaval as people moved from rural communities into urban communities, and into urban communities that were not ready to receive them. So the housing in which they were living was appalling, because it was literally thrown up overnight, and families were just shoved into one room and left there to rot. And there was no sanitation, there was insufficient food because people were leaving the land, and so food production was going down, but the need for food in the towns was going up. There were frequent crop failures. There were frequent food shortages. After the end of the war, the corn laws that were passed restricted access to cheap food, and for many women, it was just literally a daily struggle to keep themselves and their children alive. And when we sort of look at them sending their children out to work in factories, and we think, God, that is awful, how could they do it? We have to look at what the choice before them was. It was send the child to work or let the child starve at home. And so women had very strong opinions about this, not surprisingly, and vented them in various ways. Women were often prominent in food riots. A food riot is not as disorganized as it sounds, and this is an area that I've also covered in the book. There was a sort of agreement about how you rioted would determine whether or not it got treated as a criminal offence. So if you took the food from the markets and sold it for a lower price, and then gave the merchants and the merchants were charging, and then sold it at a cheaper price, and then gave the money back to the person from whom you'd taken the goods, that didn't count as theft. And so you were unlikely to be charged with either theft or what it actually was technically counted as, which was highway robbery, which was a capital offence. But the key thing was that you gave the money back. So you hadn't stolen it because of the money, you had stolen it from hunger. It was almost the law suggesting that hunger was a reasonable reason for theft. It wouldn't quite, but, very close. Women were also involved in the early trade union movement, which I haven't covered, but there were women's trade societies, there were women's organisations, usually springing up around single issues. There are a few well-known strikes, like a lace workers' strike in Nottingham, which was predominantly of women. But things would overlap. So in that strike, the women got a loaf of bread and drenched it in some kind of animal's blood and stuck it on the end of a pole, and it must have looked like a head on a pole, and quite alarmed people. So there were women doing things like that, and then there were also women getting involved in the politics, women supporting their husbands who were involved in the politics. In 1817, the government suspended habeas corpus and rounded up all the leaders of the reform movements, and obviously the Home Office intercepted their mail. But this is Britain, and so there is bureaucracy and things have to be filed, and the files end up in the National Archives, so we can still read what the women of the time wrote to their husbands in prison, and many of those letters are intensely political. Some aren't, some are just really sad, but some of them are very political and demonstrate several things. A, women were political, B, they weren't afraid of saying so, and C, they could read and write. And female literacy at this point amongst working class women was much higher than it was later. It went down in the early Victorian period, but it was quite high because of Methodist Sunday schools. Reform societies often ran schools. There were radical schools. There were ragged schools of various types. Most working class children had access to some kind of education. Most girls were taught to read and many girls were taught to write. So they also had access to political works. So working class women read the same things as working class men read. And they also read things like Mary Wollstonecraft and Anna Letitia Barbauld, who both of whom were popular in northern industrial towns, which is not what you think they would be if you, again, believed the narrative of helpless, ignorant, uneducated working class women.
So you've talked about how they were well received, but I suppose these women weren't well received by everybody, and potentially the majority, or those with power and the loudest voices within society at the time. And I think you sort of niftily demonstrated that throughout the book, in that your chapter titles are titles that of language given to these women by other people in kind of derogatory ways to kind of discredit the woman. And you know, I was thinking, and as I do now, kind of reflections on politics as it stands today, that actually it was the politics and the disruption that these women stood for, that the powers detested. But it was far easier to discredit the person than it was the political idea. And I just wondered if you've got any parallels to draw from what we see happening when women enter public life today on that point.
I think that there are direct parallels. And in fact, I don't think they're parallels. I think they are the same thing. I think the question of women's voices in the public space was hugely contested then, and is still contested now. The abuse that women at the time received is very similar to the abuse, if not identical, when it comes to the sexual abuse that women receive now. Obviously, women of colour now get even worse, and there were very few women of colour involved in political movements that I could find, and I did look at the time, but you just know it would have been, it would have been very similar had there been. And then as now, the idea was to shut the women up, to drive them out of the space, to make the space so uncomfortable and so difficult for women to occupy that they either go and sit quietly at the back or they leave the space altogether. And throughout the last 200 years, women have sort of come and gone from the public space in that sense. This happens to be a period when women chose to occupy it, and now is a period when women choose to occupy it. If there had been social media then, it would have been brutal. There were huge numbers of newspapers then. Everybody read at least one newspaper, and everybody could read at least one newspaper, and the way in which the women described is just as horrible as now. The difference now is that women have political rights, and women then did not. And so there is that real shift in status. But the issue of whether women should be exercising those rights is still a thing. Anna Doyle, one of the things that Anna Doyle Wheeler and William Thompson said was that they thought women should have absolutely equal political rights with men, which was further than the later suffrage movement went. It has to be said, they thought all women, all adults should have the vote. including women, but they did say that they thought that in itself would not be enough inducement to get women to take up what would be a very difficult profession, and that it would take more than just giving women the vote to get women political equality. And I think that is true. And one of the reasons for that is the contested nature of women's presence in the public space.
Fascinating. And just to give some examples there of the horrid nature of the comments directed at women at the time, I won't go through all the chapters.
No, because it takes some time.
Indeed, but wicked little Democrats, such mighty rage, the she champion of impiety, all directed as terms of abuse for women, which I think you've wonderfully reclaimed for them through this book. And I suppose that will then be my last question before we open it all. If you were to reclaim one of these titles, one of these insults that were hurled at women at the time, to best describe you, what one would you go for?
Well, I don't think it would be the most abandoned of her sex. I quite like the mighty rage one. I'll have to look at the list to let me think. There are so many of them. I do like the she champion of impiety. I think, and then I quite like more turbulent than the men. And I mean, by and large, they are, I think I'll pass on beyond expression horrible, though. I think probably the she champion of impiety and the mighty rage.
Well, the one I choose for you, Nan, is very clever, awfully revolutionary, because writing this book in itself is an incredible act. It's a revolutionary one, to ensure that we know our past, we know about these women, we continue to learn and grow. They're part of our movement pre the Labour movement. I'd like to think that they would absolutely stand with us in sister solidarity and be part of the Labour Women's Network if they were here today, because we certainly share a lot of common ground. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being so generous with your time this evening. Thank you for launching your book with LWN. I've had a wonderful time. I could talk, as many of you well know, for many hours more on this point, but I have had the opportunity to ask my questions. So for the remainder of the time, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to go to, I haven't managed to keep on top of the chat, but I believe Claire has been looking at some of the questions coming in. So to ensure that we also finish promptly, Claire, I'm going to ask you for maybe 3 questions, if there are 3, 2 to 3, that can be asked at Nan in one go, and then we can hear Nan's response.
Thanks so much, Kieran. So first of all, Nadine asks, were there any female historians battling to keep the women in the narrative? Obviously not sufficient to counterbalance the amount that male historians determined to write us out. Erin asks, who do you see as today's uncontrollable women who would appear in this book if it was written again in a century's time? And Shanzida asks, what made you give the book the title Uncontrollable Women, and any reflections on the pace of change for women now compared with then? And keep the questions coming. I'll fish out some more if we've time.
I'll start at the back end, but I would have forgotten the first one by the time I get there. So the book is called Uncontrollable Women because it is taken from a quotation about a very angry woman on the night of Peterloo, who was arrested outside a grocer's shop where the proprietor had by some means acquired Mary Files's flag, by then bloodstained, and was displaying it in triumph from his window, and a crowd had gathered outside to protest about this and put his windows in, rescue the flag. And she was amongst this crowd, and she was absolutely enraged. And she was described as an uncontrollable woman whose tongue no human hand could still. And I thought that because such a lot of this book is about women's voice and the uses of women's voice, that I thought it was a good, apart from the fact that it's a good title, I just thought it was a good title for the book, because within the constraints of their time, all of these women were uncontrollable and were kicking over the traces. Who would I describe as the uncontrollable women of now? Any woman who challenges the status quo, basically, and there are a lot of women around doing that. I should point out that they wouldn't be exclusively Labour. There would be some to the left of the party and some to the right of the party, much as we might dislike that. But any woman who just looks at the conditions in which she is living and says, no, just no, this is not what I'm passing on, and this is not what I'm prepared to live under. So I think there are a lot of them around at the moment, as there were then. And the first question was?
The first question was, who do you see as today's uncontrollable?
Just done that.
Women, sorry.
Done that.
Done that.
The first question was, in fact, about historians at the time. Was there anyone?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Yes, that's a good one.
There were female historians. I told you women were doing everything. There was a woman called Catherine Macaulay who, in the 18th century, who was publishing history. There were other female historians. There were not female or male historians of women, because, or not in the political sense, because for most people, women didn't have a history. If you have no legal, political, social, economic, or personal existence, if as a married woman you are assumed to have been absorbed into your husband and to be one person with him in a way that it's we've long since lost any real sense of, you don't have a history. Your history is his history. And so there were not women writing specifically about the history of women. I should say I don't like the term women's history, because that does suggest that women are only of interest to women. And I think that the world would be a better place if the history of women was taught as part of mainstream history and not sort of siphoned off somewhere else into a separate place where only women go. So a lot of what we do know is aside. Some of these women I picked up through footnotes in other people's books. So, you know, E.P. Thompson and The Making of the Working Class is a great place for picking up women in the footnotes, because you're not going to pick them up much anywhere else. Great book though it isn't chock-a-block with women. There are some good history of Chartist women, and really from that point on we begin to get more of a sense of women in mainstream history. But really, until you get to the late 19th, early 20th century, there's relatively little interest in preserving the history of women as women. They're there as something else, particularly if they're exceptional. But their exceptionalism usually has to fit with whatever the perceptions of the times were. It's always, and I could never quite understand why the Victorians loved Boudica so much, because, you know, massacring 100,000 people doesn't usually get you a good reputation in history. But there we go.
Well,
Lovely.
Thank you for answering those questions. And also I think the point that you made there, that, you know, moving women from the margins to the main page, so out of the footnotes and into the book itself, is a wonderful thing. I've read it cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. I recommend you all, if you haven't done so already, and I can see in the chat some of you have, buy the book, share the book, pass it on. Yes, hand it to your daughters, but hand it to your sons as well. Donate them to school libraries. Keep talking about it, tweet all about it, because it's fascinating. And the more people know this part of our shared story, our shared past, we can be inspired, and I think gain hope, and sometimes that much needed persistence to persist, which is what we know, many of us on this call this evening do. So thank you, Nan. Please buy the book. Also, another request from me at just before the end, if you haven't seen Labour Women's Network training offer, please do have a look. Please do sign up. Maybe that will be a part of your journey to make history like some of these women did that we've heard about tonight. So thank you all. It's been wonderful this evening, and I'm sure this is not going to be the last time we hear Nan Sloane talking about uncontrollable women.
No, well, thank you all very much for coming, and for listening, and for being interested, and hopefully for reading it and enjoying it. And as Kieran says, as you know, I'll be banging on about this for some time, so I look forward to seeing you all at other events. Thank you.